Hello and welcome to The Moster Show. My name is Naftuli Moster and I'm excited to introduce you to the very first episode of The Moster Show, a podcast and video broadcast that will publish weekly where we will discuss current events, politics, and more as it pertains to the Orthodox Jewish community, the broader Jewish community, and beyond. First, let me introduce myself. I was born and raised in Borough Park section of Brooklyn, New York. I was born into a Hasidic Jewish family. I am the middle child of 17 kids from one father and one mother. After growing up in a pretty insular community, I began charting my own path at around the age 20 when I decided to pursue a college degree, which is an uncommon thing to do in the Chareidi world. During that time, I also became quite resentful about certain practices in the Chareidi world, especially the focus on Judaic studies, almost to the exclusion of secular studies. It made things very difficult for me. It made it difficult to get into college. It made it difficult to succeed in college. It made it very difficult to get a job. When I did get a job, it was working in a dirty warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, and I was further enraged. Why would a guy like me, a smart and capable, intelligent guy who usually excelled in my Judaic studies, be forced to work such menial labor? It happens to be that my boss, a Hasidic guy, was the nicest mensch you could find. Even 10 years later, he still invites me to his children's weddings and sends me free products when I need. And I hope maybe one day to have him as a guest on the podcast. But the work was grueling, and I felt that given my studious nature and my intellect, I should have been able to do better. Anyway, I eventually started an organization that was advocating to improve the secular education in the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities. During my 10 years of running the organization, I did probably about 500 media interviews. I wrote dozens of articles. I raised millions of dollars, oversaw our legal cases, and much more. Then I decided to move on. This time, I founded a news outlet. The idea of the news outlet was to provide a real media outlet for and about the Chareidi community. The argument for it was that the Chareidi community doesn't have an independent press and that the broader Jewish community doesn't know sort of the deep, dark secrets of the Chareidi world. And this news outlet would essentially accomplish two things at once: give Chareidim a free and independent press, and give the broader Jewish community and anyone who wants a window into this community. Given my own feelings towards the community, I focused heavily on the kind of stories that are investigative and critical in nature, basically the stories that perhaps the outsiders would be more interested than the Chareidim itself, and which, of course, didn't particularly make the Chareidi community look good. I recently did a whole interview with Frieda Wiesel, a successful podcaster, where I actually discussed my move away from that kind of work and how my perspective in general has changed pretty drastically. And later in this episode, when I sit down with my guests, we will discuss it a bit more. But I want to make something clear right from the get-go that unlike my previous work, The Moster Show will not seek to be critical or exposing of the ultra-Orthodox and Chareidi communities. Rather, it will discuss current events as it pertains to the Orthodox community as a whole and to some extent the broader Jewish community and even beyond. It will highlight some of the commonality and the humanity of the Orthodox Jewish community, including all its subgroups, the Modern Orthodox, the Litvish, Yeshivish, the Hasidic or Hasidish community that they have with the rest of society. I envision the audience for the show will be people from the full spectrum of the Orthodox Jewish world and beyond. If you're here to process the current events, the day-to-day struggles and successes of regular people, you're my target audience. If you happen to be religious or from a religious background, or if you're a New Yorker or New Jersey resident and you want to better get to know your neighbors who are, Jewish, or if you're a policymaker and you want to understand this important constituency, you're my target audience. If you're here to hear gossip of the Orthodox community or to dig up dirt to create a negative narrative about Jews or the Orthodox community, this show is not for you. I think you'll enjoy. I hope you do. And please subscribe to the channel today and share it with your friends. Here's how the show will work. Each week, we'll publish a full episode, but each episode will be broken down into a few parts or segments. We might have a monologue from myself, an interview with one person on a specific topic, a segment on current events in the news, and this may be with either one additional person or with a panel of people, depending on what is currently dominating the headlines. And finally, we will have a segment specifically on anti-Semitism called the Anti-Semitism Court. This may not happen weekly, and it's certainly not happening for this first episode, but essentially we'll have a panel of judges who will review the various incidents that occurred over the prior week, and we will hash it out. And then through a majority vote, we'll arrive at a verdict on whether that incident constitutes anti-Semitism or not. The show will be a little bit like the Bill Maher show in terms of the monologue, the one-on-one interview, the panel discussions and such. And like his show, I hope this show will contain lots of humor and levity while still addressing some very important issues. I hope to have people of all political backgrounds come onto the show, and we will, of course, engage with everyone respectfully. If you would like to come on the show or you want us to invite a particular person onto the show, please email us at info@themostershow.com. If you would like to nominate someone, yourself or someone else, to be on the Anti-Semitism Court panel, please email us at antisemitism@themostershow.com. Similarly, if an anti-Semitic incident happened to you that is not in the news yet and you would like for us to discuss it on that segment, again, please contact us at antisemitism@themostershow.com. We're still experimenting with the format and the content, so please be sure to check us out consistently to see how things evolve and develop. My first guest on the show is another Moster. In fact, it's my own wife, Miriam. I recently did an interview with Frieda Wiesel where I name-dropped Miriam multiple times throughout the interview, and I figured we should have her on this show and expand on it right here. Hello, Miriam.
Hi, Naftuli.
Thank you for joining us. So, as I mentioned in the intro, I recently sat down with Frieda Wiesel for an interview, and I name-dropped you on a few occasions, and I figured it would be great for our audience to hear more about you and from you, about your background, your research, and what you're up to now. So, if you could tell us a little bit about your own upbringing, which community you grew up in, what type of schools you attended, and what kind of education you got, both Jewish and secular, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, sure. I grew up in the Litvish community. I went to Prospect Park Yeshiva growing up. It's a girls' school. Haredi, moderate, girls only. Very fine education. We were English speaking growing up.
You and I met when you were disenchanted with the shidduch dating system in the community. Can you speak a little bit more about the issues you encountered as a single woman in shidduchim, which to our audience, it's the time when people are seeking partners essentially to get married. It's not an arranged marriage in your community. It's more of a setup perhaps, but then it happens a little bit more organically than in the community that I grew up in. So if you could tell us a little bit about the issues you encountered and sort of how we met then.
Sure. So I was shidduch dating around right before we met, actually. I was 20 years old when I met you. And I thought I'd be married before I was 20, in my community too. You're from a Hasidic community, so it's kind of almost all but guaranteed that you're married by that point. In my community, people start dating around 19, sometimes even 18, and they start getting married around 19, 20 years old. So that deadline in my head was before my 20th birthday, and that came and went. And I felt very old for that deadline to have passed. I also had a harder time because my parents are divorced, so it just makes it much harder to get shidduchim in that market, in that shidduch market. And so, when 20 came and went, and it was hard to find quality boys who would go out with me, I just gave up on the system. We all have our crazy dating stories we can share. So I had my share of those that were off-putting experiences, from the shidduch world. But I was still very resolved to get married. I was still in that marriage mindset. And then at 20 years old, I met you.
Right. Right. And you said you were having a hard time finding quality boys, and then you met me. So
I got lucky.
that's a good,
Yeah.
that reflects pretty nicely of me. So we met, we dated, we got married, and for a pretty long time, me having sort of left the Chareidi world, and you having left yours, so to speak, for a long while, we were living a not particularly observant life, right? And there were a few things that happened. Of course, I was running the organization that I was running and doing that kind of advocacy. You were pursuing your college degree, and there were a few things that were sort of like converging together that sort of shifted things for us a lot. Some of it had to do with the kind of research you were doing, and some of it had to do with just maturing, having children, and sort of living in the real world. So if you could tell us a little bit more about sort of this, how we went from living that non-religious, non-observant life to where we are now.
Yeah. So when we first met, I was kind of on my way out when I met you. And, you know, I think dating at that stage in life, but not through a shidduch system, kind of in some way, you know, puts you on the other side of the community. You're not doing things that the system and the religious community expects you to do, right? So you're kind of automatically on the other side, and it's a choice, but it's also it's a choice that comes with consequences. But sometimes, like, the extent of those consequences are more far-reaching than you might have planned. So then the peer group you associate are other people that are, you know, more casually dating, I guess, or even seriously dating, but outside of that system. And so, yeah, we actually developed a really nice community on the outside, I would say, for that stage of our lives. And we were there for a while, you know, then we got married, but we didn't have kids yet. And that's where we placed ourselves. We were kind of in academic communities where we found a peer group and friendships and things like that. And I guess you could say an OTD community where we made really close friendships with people from similar backgrounds to ourselves and in similar places to ourselves. And then we had our son. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it wasn't just about ourselves, it was about where we wanted to raise our child.
But it wasn't immediately when we had our first child, right? For a while we were comfortable living even a secular life with our child, right?
I beg to differ. I felt it right away. I think that mothers need community. You know, there's something like once you become, it's a little bit selfish, right? I keep saying it's for the kids. It was also in part for myself.
100%.
That I needed other mothers. And that's where you find it, you know, in religious community, by going to shul, things like that's where I knew to find community. And so yeah, that's when I started feeling like I missed it. That's when I started longing for it again, is once we had our son, even when he was a baby. And I used to go sometimes to the conservative shul programming.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. Okay, so that's what I was going to say. Okay, you're right. But I mean, that's what I meant. That we were integrated a little bit integrated in the conservative world to the extent that that's possible. But I just meant like we still didn't conceive of this idea of joining the Orthodox world again. Right. You know, to the contrary, I think we felt very strongly against it. We would feel, I don't think either of us could dream of sort of ever being back in the Orthodox world, let alone sending our kid to an Orthodox school. Yeah. Right?
If it's okay to share, we could, you know. Yeah. But I just remember when we first got married, I once posed that question to you. Do you remember? I said, like, what's the religious red line you would never cross, or you wouldn't ever let me cross? Yeah. You know, like, because we were completely not religious at that point when we first got married. Okay. You know, like, almost like, what would be a marriage-ending red line if this happened? No. And you said, becoming religious at all. It's just not for me. Do you remember that?
Oh, my God. Okay, TMI maybe, okay. But I'm joking. It's all good.
It's your call if you want to include it, but
No, it's all good. You're right, and I do remember that. And at the time, it just felt like the farthest thing that we could ever do. We saw all the rationalizations for being rational, for being
Not just that, we thought the world was harmful. Like we had experienced harm ourselves in that world.
You mean the world, the Haredi world?
Yeah, the Chareidi world. There was a reason. There were reasons we left. The shidduch system I thought was toxic for me. Like I thought it was. I mean, not toxic's a strong word, but it was problematic. But then once you leave, you start noticing the problems more. Also,
that's the point. That's the point I'm trying to drill in, or get to, is I think that part of what we've discovered, and that did start right when we had our first kid, it was where we started realizing that communities across the board have problems. Everything from, in academia, I think both you and I, when we were pursuing our degrees, were discovering a lot of issues. We discovered a lot of issues in the OTD community. It's ironic, actually. We had these friends who were OTD, not formerly Chareidi and non-observant, who were like telling us, don't make the same mistake we did, right? Don't send them to a public school. Don't send. And at the time, we were laughing them off. We were like, you're still so close-minded, right? You're still, and then shortly after, when it came time to actually send them to school, and we're like, oh my God, now we get it, right? Things started opening up. I think, but there were like a few things that converged together. I still remember when you started working on your PhD, which was just when we had our first son, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. When you were like
he was
literally
about a year old, yeah.
Yeah, I thought you were
I applied
right
when he was.
postpartum.
I applied when I was postpartum.
Right.
I was a few months postpartum when I applied to the program,
Right,
but it
right.
started the following academic year.
And you started studying various things. You went for sociology, and it was interesting. You would come home and talk to me about your findings, and oftentimes it was not confirming your hypothesis, so to speak. In other words, you went into it studying one thing, and you came out realizing something else. And I recall vividly you studying something about collective memory, I think it was, which is a big Jewish concept. You can elaborate a little bit on it. And then, you kept talking to me about how education and intelligence was such a big thing in the Jewish world. And it was quite eye-opening to me at the time.
The collective memory piece, I've never published this. It was a course paper. I should probably do something with it. But it was exploring the relationship between culture and outcomes when it comes to education in the Jewish world.
Mm-hmm.
So what I looked at was the way historically we've placed narratives into our past. We've written these narratives that emphasize education and the value of learning, and it's happened over hundreds of years, but it's kind of this reciprocal relationship between the thing you value and the stories you tell about that value, and the way telling those stories helps continue shaping those values. Right. So you see this kind of like circular relationship in the way that value is built and developed and reinforced over time.
Right. But still, in that context, I was like kind of blown away and very proud of the Jewish heritage, which at that point I didn't feel so strongly about. And I'm talking about any Jewish denomination, even if we technically attended some conservative, services and programming, I didn't feel part of it. But suddenly I was like, no, why am I not proud to be a Jewish person? You know what I mean? And I think that's what came out from some of your studies. So let's go back to sort of how we ended up going from the conservative or non-observant world to modern Orthodoxy. Tell us.
Yeah. So what happened was when our son was very young, we were looking for nurseries for him and then for schools. And at that point, we decided we did want to raise our kid with a Jewish lifestyle and Jewish values and Jewish culture and the traditions. And we thought conservative would be like our happy middle ground, right? It wouldn't be as extreme as the way we were brought up. It wouldn't be secular either. We thought we'd found that perfect spot for our family. And we enrolled our son in a pre-K program that was conservative. And it was actually very foreign to us. There were a few things that stood out. One was how different we were from the other families in the school. Like, I thought we'd have more of a community the way school was for us growing up, where your school was part of your community. Mm-hmm. We tried inviting people for Shabbos meals, thinking, we'd have the parents over and we get to know the parents too and the kids could play.
Right.
And it never really materialized. Like, these parents, it turned out, what we learned later was that these were parents that were planning on sending their kids to public school, but for pre-K, there is no public school. There was universal pre-K, so you could send your kid anywhere and get funding wherever you sent. So long as it was free, and they're Jewish, they'd send to a Jewish pre-K program. But a lot of them, weren't doing these things, weren't.
Right. Shabbos was a big birthday party day, right? That's when they threw all the birthday parties for the kids.
I remember there was one that was walking distance, and at that point we were keeping Shabbos again, and you walked our son over to the birthday, so he wouldn't miss out on the opportunity to be with his
90
friends.
90+ degree.
Yeah, and in the summer.
Walking over a half hour.
Yeah, quite a
It was
day.
really crazy.
But yeah, that it wasn't Shabbos meal day.
Someone offered me a ride on the way back.
Oh, that was thoughtful.
And I waved them down. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I waved them off.
I think that's when we started realizing the parts of our Jewish heritage that we wanted to raise our kids with, we weren't going to get in a system like that, and especially because, and also that there would be no continuity. So when I saw we were the only our son was the only child in his grade. There were 2 parallel classes in that pre-K program that ended up going to a Jewish school.
Right.
Everyone else went to public school.
Right.
And that was standard there.
Right. I remember you discussing with the parents before.
Yeah, I was asking them, where are you sending your kids?
Yes.
What schools are you looking into? And they weren't looking, because for public school, you just go where your district places you. It wasn't even a search. There was nothing, no thought. So do
you remember the spreadsheet that you created?
Yeah.
It was hanging in our kitchen, right next to the kitchen table, just like this. It was on the wall, massive Post-it note. That you turned it into like a chart, and you charted out basically what's out there, where we want to sort of land.
Right, and we had everything from public school, non-Jewish private school, a range of conservative schools in the neighborhood, and then the modern Orthodox schools. And I think I might have even included some more Haredi schools.
You did.
I did, because we did look into those at the time.
No, we wanted to have it all there and spell out all the criteria or whatever features of each school, right?
Yeah.
It was all mapped out, and then you were like, okay, we're obviously not doing this extreme. We're obviously not doing this extreme. And then.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also asked a lot of parents. So we were talking to parents who sent to conservative elementary schools, because that's still where I thought we'd find our place.
Right.
But then what I found was a lot of the parents I spoke to said, yeah, we're sending up until middle school, but we plan on switching out to public school.
Right.
Or we'll send for elementary, but we'll probably switch to public for high school.
Right.
And I realized we're going to keep hitting that same problem where there's no community and no continuity.
Right.
If kids keep transferring out.
And if I'm not mistaken, at that point, you were already studying, not because it was your focus, but because you're an academic and you came across a lot of different interesting articles. You were already very much anti-technology for children.
Yes.
And I think that was a big deal. And you started noticing the decline in the mental health among youth in the general society. And perhaps you were like, that's not something. To that degree, we didn't have that in our communities, and you started sort of being able to piece together and make sense about what is it that's causing, or at least contributing to all these problems in the general society, versus why we're not necessarily seeing so much of it in the Orthodox and Chareidi societies.
I mean, this is not just me. This is of the moment that already at that point you're starting to see articles coming out. John Haidt has a major book that came out a few years ago, but leading up to the publication of that book, he was publishing articles on the topic. And, so there was already, the alarm bells were ringing that this is a problem, but a lot of people were ignoring it. But yeah, so initially I was drawn, even before we sent to that conservative school, we sent our son to a Waldorf nursery.
Mm-hmm,
Waldorf is an anti-technology private school system. They have them, across the country. And I actually thought it would be nice both for the anti-technology, a nice value system. If we're not going to raise our kid religious, at least we'll get a nice value system packaged in with education and community. It kind of was branded as this very community-oriented school.
Right.
But
I think there is an element of
there was something very nice about it.
Yeah.
But there was no Jewish education at all. There were other reasons that it wasn't a perfect fit for our family.
Yeah.
That we learned once we tried it out.
Yeah.
It is for other people, but it didn't work for us. So yeah, that was something. And honestly, the Chareidi world does that best. The anti-technology, the limits, especially for kids.
Right. So then, you started seriously considering modern Orthodox schools, and we were like, we've seen friends of ours, non-religious ones, people who've left, who actually did sort of send their kids to modern Orthodox schools, and we felt that if the family is not in it, it's going to impact the kids in a negative way.
Yeah.
They're going to feel sort of similar to how our kid felt going to a school where everyone went to public school, their kids felt a little bit out of place when everyone else lived around the school area, participated in all the kinds of communal things that the school is connected to. And if these parents didn't do that, the kids felt a little bit left out.
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about this. Like, what does it mean if it's not just sending our kid to a school? It's a lifestyle that comes with it.
100%.
And we were even considering schools that were a little more to the right than the school we ended up sending. We actually tried. You know, our kid couldn't get into those schools.
Well, we were going to do it reluctantly, but that's
it was
a topic
something
for another time.
Right, but it was on our radar. But
Yeah.
it wasn't. It was kind of out of our hands either way, that decision.
Right.
But
basically, you started doing research into the modern Orthodox communities.
Yeah.
You even went to check out a few.
we did Shabbos visits. We did the school tours.
Yeah,
I
and it
spoke
felt
to
a little
people.
weird. It felt a little weird, maybe even a little bit sort of sneaky or hypocritical, right?
Yeah.
Although we did start becoming more observant a few months before that.
Once we made that decision that we
Yeah.
were going to send our kid to a modern Orthodox school, that was the school system that we
Right.
had chosen, even before we knew the specific school.
Exactly.
And we knew that means it's a package deal for our whole family.
Right.
You know, we weren't going to say, okay, you're going to school and you're learning about
Right.
Shabbos, but come home and we're going to go for a drive, on
Right.
Shabbos. We weren't going to do that.
Exactly.
So we stopped, and it was actually harder those early months because we were keeping Shabbos in a vacuum. We were keeping
in
Shabbos
a place that we didn't have any community
right.
yet. Exactly.
So it was very isolating those
Yeah.
first few months of
Yeah,
Shabbosim. But those were probably the hardest ones, and then
I feel like people tuning into this would be like, wow, this is such a Kiruv podcast. It's not. It's just talking about our experience.
But I think here's another piece that could be relevant to a lot of people and to the Kiruv work in general, right? Like there's a lot of focus on bringing back the teens and bringing back even young adults, not the marrieds, right? There are a lot of on-ramps for teens at risk. There are no on-ramps back or fewer or poorer on-ramps back for families with kids.
True.
It's more of a choice. It takes a lot more work to come back. It takes more. I mean, there's a lot to be gained, but there's also some sacrifice that you feel. There's less help. There's less facilitation along the way.
Right.
And that I think is something for the community to think about.
Yeah.
Because
it's a very concrete thing we can take out of this. Yeah.
And also because people in our position are the ones that often want to come back. Like I talk to if you look at who Lynn Davidman, she's a researcher, a sociologist who wrote a work on OTDs, and one of the things she found there was that some of the people actually ended up coming back, and it was usually the ones who were married with kids. It's at that stage of life that you start reevaluating. You have different priorities.
Right.
You rethink your place.
Right.
And knowing that could also be kind of a target area of like how do you create on-ramps for people in that position.
Interesting.
It's
take note, Kiruv groups,
and I think it's tricky because there's capacity issues with the school in general, right? Like Chareidi schools are running out of room for their own. So are you going to make room for the family?
You have more people. You can make more schools. But let's fast forward. The main research that you've done, this is your dissertation for your PhD in sociology. This was about divorce and the Haredi world. Okay. Yeah. Perhaps it was a little bit motivated because you came from a family of divorce.
Well, I didn't tell myself that when I started the research. I can tell you a bit about how I got into it. But you're probably right. There might have been a piece of that in it.
Right. And by the way, you have a wonderful family that I'm so privileged to be part of. So, divorce, no divorce, your parents did a really good job at reestablishing beautiful families. But tell us a little bit about this. What was your hypothesis, so to speak? Again, I know this doesn't have a hypothesis per se, but what did you think going into it that you'll sort of come out with?
Okay, yeah. So with sociology, it's not like psychology where you go in with a running hypothesis. A little different, the way you structure the research.
Right.
But I did go into this knowing we were part of the OTD community at the time. And we had friends. There are a lot of people in the OTD community, especially the young adult community, who are divorcees.
Yeah.
Right? So divorcees, and at the time, and there are also these crazy exposés, a lot of the stories that come out in the news and the memoirs and the documentaries, are
going through grueling custody battles and parental alienation.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Right. So I decided I want to study this. I want to help these people. I want to give them a playbook, for when they're going through these hard times. I'm going to do the research and I'll find out what works, what can help these, what tools can they have, what resources can they have, what can they learn from other people.
Right.
So I want to interview OTD divorcees. That's what I want to do.
But how many people did you interview? Were they Chareidi? Were they OTD?
By the end of the research project, by the end of my dissertation, I interviewed, I think it was 54 people.
Okay.
They were a range of Chabad, Hasidish, different denominations, Litvish, and also a subset of them were not divorcees themselves, but were kind of like self-styled activists or formal activists or people who worked with a divorced population, who helped with, people going through divorce. So they weren't speaking for their own circumstances, but speaking for a group of people that they had worked with, so they could give me like kind of collective experiences or what they had taken from these experiences, knowing a bunch of them. So what struck me even at the beginning of the research was I'd be connected to people who were OTD divorced, and I'd contact them, can we set up an interview? And we'd start the interview and say, I just want to let you know, I don't know if I'm the right person for your research because I wasn't planning on going OTD when I got divorced. Like I happen to be OTD now, but that wasn't the reason I got divorced.
Right.
And I said, don't worry, I still am interested in your story. And the more people I interviewed, the more people had that starting story to me. Like I'm OTD now, but that's what came out in a lot of their stories.
And I think you said some people even told you, I'm not even OTD now.
Yeah, or like some people, I don't know what I am. I don't know where I am right now. That came up in a bunch of stories for the ones who were recently divorced. Right. And so what came out of this, it wasn't, we often think, especially because there's so much in the religious community, in the Haredi community, that's a reason for divorce. There are not a lot of valid reasons for divorce in that community, but if your spouse is not religious, that's a valid reason that's considered a valid reason.
True.
And what I was finding was that a lot of these people they leave religion after the divorce. There's something about this process that alienated them from the community. They didn't even want to leave, but they lost their place in the community in the process. And another thing that happened, this was like kind of unfortunate, but in a subset of cases, the divorce process can be very acrimonious. This is true in the Chareidi world. Outside of it, just divorce is not a happy process. And what would happen in some cases is that one spouse would start spreading rumors about the other. The rumors could be anything, but in the Chareidi community, one kind of rumor that was not uncommon was rumors about the religiosity of the other spouse. So spreading rumors that the spouse they're divorcing is not religious or not religious enough.
I see. So like you said earlier, that in the Haredi context, there aren't a lot of reasons to get divorced. But one that is sort of seen as a good enough reason is if your spouse is not religious. So if this person, man or woman, felt very strongly to get out of that marriage, they knew if they say, well, here's why I want to get out of the marriage, this, and that, and because my spouse is not religious, they would get more support, more backing from people to say, oh, yeah, you're right, you should get divorced, right?
Mixed. I would take a more nuanced approach. I think they might have believed the narratives they were telling, right? I don't want to say that they were lying. In some cases, you might just have this really vindictive ex who just is doing anything they can to make your life miserable. You're getting divorced, they hate you, and they'll make up any lies they can. Right. In some cases, I think, people's religiosity fluctuates over the course of the marriage. Could it possibly be that one spouse had grown lax in some area and the other spouse wanted a divorce and really resented them and they were picking on that thing, and blowing it up? So I don't know how malicious or how intentional it was, to lie, but it certainly worked, even if a spouse didn't feel like they were leaving themselves.
So tell us more. So ultimately, and what was the conclusion, so to speak, or many conclusions you've come out with? Yeah.
So a main one was that really had to do with the process of leaving. Because what I ended up doing, it started off as a project studying OTD divorcees. And then I started interviewing these people who said, well, my plan wasn't to leave the community. It just kind of happened. And then they told me their stories. And then I said, well, wouldn't it be interesting to compare these divorcees who left, whether they intended to leave, whether they left before they got out of their marriage, whether they left after, kind of unintentionally, with those divorcees who actually stayed married. Because it turns out that divorcees, we did this study together it was a partnership between Shtetl and Nishma Research. And one of the questions we asked of people who were religious and who weren't, and who were OTD, Haredi versus OTD, was, are you or were you ever divorced?
That was our post-October 7.
Right. So we published the things related to October 7 anti-Semitism. Right. This is one of the questions we haven't actually published, but there were much higher rates of divorce among the OTD population. This was kind of coming out in the interviews that divorcees have a higher exit rate. I wasn't getting numbers. It wasn't a survey. Right. But it seems like a high-risk population for exit. Like they're more at risk of leaving the community even after, right? It's not that you're going OTD so you leave, but something about this divorce process is alienating them from their community.
Right.
So then I decided, why don't I compare them to, like, because that's the best study, is comparative.
Okay.
Right? If you want to understand why something's happening, don't just ask the people who are doing it, because sometimes the answer that I've shared this with you, that, you know, sometimes if you ask someone, why did you leave, right? They can say, I left because I didn't like certain practices in the religious community, or I didn't believe, you know, and you have no way. Researchers have actually pointed this out as a limitation of their own research and studies of exit, that when you ask these questions, sure, that's what they say, and it might even be true, but it also might be the case that if you ask people who were still religious these same questions, right? Not why did you leave, but what do you think about X? They'd give you the same answer, but it just wasn't a reason for leaving. They have stayed, right? So if you ask them, like, do you ever question your faith? People who are religious might say, yeah, you know, I have my uncertainties, I have my doubts, I have my questions.
Right.
But that's not making them leave the religious group.
Right.
If you ask people who left, why did you leave? They might say it's because I had doubts about my faith. So the doubts, you can't say doubt is a reason for exit, because you could have doubts on both sides.
True. So there have to be other.
So what other factors,
stimuli,
right, so that you can then point to those doubts and saying, I had doubts, right? And that's your reason for exit. So I decided to look at both the divorcees who stayed religious and those who left side by side, to see what's going on in their lives, what factors, either before the divorce, during the divorce process, or after the divorce, separated them from the ones who ended up leaving. And there were a whole range of factors.
So what's the conclusion?
The conclusion is that there are a lot of things that happen during the divorce that alienate people from religious life. You know, this is a larger conversation for a different topic, and it also extends beyond divorcees. What institutions keep people within the community? What institutions loosen their hold on people when they're divorced? Or what do people kind of distance themselves from through the process of this divorce? And it happens also not just to the divorcees, but you can say that's why, let's say, maybe the category of older singles are more at risk of drifting away, because they're not as institutionally or communally held at that point in their lives.
Right. So they don't have that strong communal glue.
That infrastructure.
Yes. Because a big part of being in the community is husband and wife, children, schools, community, the shul. It's all part of your life. And suddenly if you're divorced, it's like it disrupts your entire, I guess, glue to the community.
Yeah, friends distance themselves even in a lot of cases because there's so much stigma attached to divorce. For some people, it even jeopardized their jobs because their jobs were so intertwined. You know, the Chareidi economy is so enmeshed in Chareidi social life.
I see.
So there were so many pieces. So I consider the economic factors part of the pieces that hold people in.
Right. To me, you know, you would often talk to me about your findings, and a big part of it was about how this idea of, you know, going from in a secular society where the divorce rate is extremely high and almost like, to some extent, encouraged when there's the slightest sort of strain on a marriage or dissatisfaction, where people encourage, you know, partners, spouses, whatever, to get divorced. Whereas here in the community, it doesn't happen so much. What were your findings as it relates?
So that was another interesting one. So one thing I did in addition to the interviews was I started listening to talks that are given by rabbis, community leaders on divorce. I would look, there was a panel by Bowie L'Shalom, I believe was the name of it. At one point, you know, they had this panel, I think it was like a Tisha B'Av movie collection that they had made. And I was listening to this talks, and I went in kind of like cynically, like, okay, like I know what I'm expecting to hear from this. They want to keep these marriages together at all costs.
Right.
But it was actually really nice, you know, like it was very, the messaging was, you know, like when you think about divorce in the outside world, it's looked at as an empowered choice. It's liberating. That's often the way it's framed, you know, very individualist. And in the Haredi community, the talks drifted right back a lot to the children.
It's all about
not about the parents, but about the kids. What will this do for your kids? Think about your children first, right? Because it's so centered on family life. Right? Don't think individually, like, will it make my life marginally better to be out of this marriage? But how will this affect my kids? That was one piece of it. And the other piece was even when they talk about divorce, when they have these panels, when they have Mishpacha magazine just had a whole series of articles a couple weeks ago on this topic, they always talk about marriage redeemed, right? So the topic is divorce, but they always throw in that story about the couple that was on the verge of getting divorced, and they figured out they could actually save their marriage, and it worked out well. So there's this really pro-marriage but beautiful messaging that you're getting in the community that I think is...
Right. And also, I think something that you've mentioned to me, and I think we both discuss, and, you know, unfortunately, we know people who got divorced, and sadly, they'll admit that the life after the divorce was not better, and in most cases worse.
This is something that came up in interviews too. When I'd ask people about their marriages, right, who got divorced, sometimes they describe really horrible marriages, and they have no regrets about the fact they got divorced. But then they describe their life post-divorce, and it's really horrible. You know,
Right.
They might have lost access to their kids. And it's just hard. You can't even weigh them on a scale of was it worth it. It's just different kinds of pain.
Right.
So, but it's a worthwhile consideration that's what the trait is. Mark Trencher, Nishma Research, did a divorce survey recently, and he just published the results. I pulled up one. I brought one sheet with me of just interesting data.
Yeah.
So one of the questions he asked was divorcees to rate whether they agreed or not with the statements. It was good that I got divorced, one statement. I'm happier now than in that marriage, statement number 2. And statement number 3, my children were better off after the divorce. And he asked this of both modern Orthodox and Haredi men and women. And so women overall were happier that they got divorced than men by a little. But there's a discrepancy for all the parents between how they rated their own happiness after the divorce and whether it was good for them versus whether their kids were better off. Only 38% thought their children were better after the divorce. So only 1 in 3 thought it was better for their kids. 2 in 3 thought it made it worse for their kids. And that's the messaging in the Haredi community.
Right.
That prioritize the kids, you know. I think, there might be things, there could be things that the Haredi community could be doing prior to marriage to make sure that you have more compatible couples going into marriage, because that might be part of it, the issues. Like certain things might be preventable.
Right.
But once you're married and once you have those kids, the considerations change.
Right.
They should change.
And it could be a nice thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know now you're looking into also just more broadly about the messaging that teens and families get from television and Netflix and all of that stuff, which it's all about, kids being glued to screens and kids being disrespectful to their parents, like that's sort of a flex or something, and so on and so forth. Marriages falling apart and, cheating and stuff being normalized. Based on what you're reading and telling me, it sounds like that's a new area that you're interested in.
Yeah. So, right, what I'm working on now is a book project based on the dissertation research, but that offers more of a cultural critique, not of the Haredi community, but of the non-Haredi lifestyle.
Right.
And says that, sometimes looking at a community like this can show us what we're missing.
Right.
So, yeah, so for example, the individualism that's a hallmark of, Western American life.
Right.
This pro-divorcement, if you think of the memoirs, the memoir you're going to read is going to be the divorce memoir, not the happily married memoir.
Right.
Right.
The memoirs of people leaving the Haredi community tends to
or
be...
Or in general, divorce memoirs. It's
Right.
That's what you'll find if you go into a bookstore.
Such a good point. Such
Yeah.
a good point. Are there some good memoirs about a successful marriage? That would be an interesting...
I don't know.
Oh, we can write it. I think we should have you on again because clearly you're fascinating and you love to study these things about social ills and successes and everything that I think is fascinating to a lot of people. What are you doing right now?
So right now I'm doing some consulting work. I'm working on that book project, but also I do private consulting for nonprofits, foundations, mostly in the Jewish world.
Like what kind of stuff?
Program evaluations, research related to specific topics. I do quantitative research, survey-based, and qualitative. That's interview-based research.
Right. Got it. Okay, and where can people find you if they would like to?
Sure. My website is miriammoster.com, and my email is info@miriammoster.com.
Very good. Thank you so much, Miriam. It's been a pleasure.
Naftali.
Thank you so much for tuning in. This week, we don't have the anti-Semitism panel up and running yet, but I do hope to have it up for the next episode. Again, if you want to reach out to us with any comments or questions or to propose panelists, please message us at info@themostershow.com. If you want to nominate yourself or someone else for the Anti-Semitism Court segment, please email antisemitism@themostershow.com. Of course, please follow us, like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future. Have a good one.